People call blockchain the new technology of trust. What do they mean by that? I'm going to explore that in a series of videos, including looking at both the hope associated with blockchain and trust, and also the complexity and caveats. Behind the blockchain trust connection is the idea that we can trust computers and computer code, but we cannot trust people. And people sometimes say that blockchain will enable trustless systems, meaning we can interact and exchange with people without needing to trust the people we're interacting with. There's a lot of truth in that, but it's also more complex than it seems, because there are some situations where you trust people more than machines. Trust is context specific. In fact, we might arrange trust contexts onto a spectrum, where on one end of the spectrum we have situations where you trust a machine more than you'd trust a person. You trust a computer more to calculate the square root of 3 or to check your spelling, for example. On the other end of the spectrum, you have situations where you trust people more than machines. For example, in medical situations where you have to designate someone to make decisions in the case where you can't make those decisions for yourself. Another example where you'd trust a human more than a machine would be deciding the curriculum of a college. What courses should students be required to take at a university? Also, policy-making decisions where policymakers have to weigh different interest groups and different values against one another. On the human trust side of the spectrum, we have more complex decisions with more caveats and more exceptions to the rule. Situations where we require more judgment calls might be best decided by a person. That side involves situations where you have to weigh competing human values, like pain versus progress, equality versus freedom, justice versus mercy, family versus community, farmers versus city dwellers. You might also have to weigh one person or group's benefits against another's. And this involves imagining yourself into the actual human experience of the different people who you're weighing against each other. That's why it's on the human end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, computers are better at achieving consistency. Computers are best when you know what to tell them to do under any given circumstance. And innovators can, of course, improve computer code over time. What that means is that the ticker determining who is more trustworthy, man or machine, that ticker moves over time as machines learn to become trustworthy in new realms. Take self-driving cars, for example. In 2012, you probably trusted the human being more than the computer to drive you across the country. But in 2042, you might actually trust the self-driving car more than the human being. And there are a bunch of things that need to happen between those two dates for computers to encode the many different situational decisions that you need to have for trustworthy driving. And blockchain will enable movement along this spectrum because it provides an efficient way of accumulating wisdom of the masses in a way that's harder to hijack by powers that have their own agenda. Now, we're talking about trust, but we should acknowledge that trust is a pretty broad, vague term. The dictionary definition of trust is a firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. But we should acknowledge that there's a difference between what people do trust and what they should trust. So we'll explore a behavioral economics definition in another video. Essentially, trust is a heuristic. It's a mental shortcut to help us make decisions more quickly because our cognitive power and decision-making abilities are limited. My point here is to say that trust is not the same as trustworthiness. For example, maybe someone trusts a company for really good, solid reasons. Like they've looked into the company's background and their policies, and they've looked into the character of the people who are leading the company, and they have good reasons to trust it. But after they've established that trust, then the trustworthiness of the company changes. For example, maybe they change the rules about how they handle your privacy and your data. And maybe they even do this behind closed doors without even telling you. Or maybe they have a turnover in their leadership which is fully transparent. But since the purpose of your life isn't to watch the politics and rule changings of all of the companies that have your data, you just don't notice. And this is complicated because in a changing world, companies have to be agile and they have to respond to changes in unexpected situations and turnover in their employment. They have to make these rule changes just to be a good company. So it's not necessarily bad if they're changing their policies or changing their leadership. Vending machines are like little companies that don't have to be agile and don't have to be responsive to their environment. But most companies are not like vending machines. If you go to an investor with a business plan and tell them that your business rules are never going to change, they're never going to respond to the changing environment and the changing needs of your customers, then nobody's going to invest in you. Changing the rules does not make your company more untrustworthy. In some ways, it's the opposite. In some ways, if you're too rigid or too unchanging, that would be more untrustworthy. So it's not the changing of the rules itself that violates trust, but it's also not necessarily the fact that they didn't tell you about the rule changes. If you got a text every time a company with your data changed a rule about how they operated, you would be super annoyed. You do not want to spend your life reading company policy changes and thinking about their implications. So most businesses require a lot more agility than a vending machine. But computer code actually has the capability of being more agile than a vending machine. See, you can write up a bunch of if-then statements into your computer code that account for different scenarios. Self-driving car designers are essentially accumulating if-then statements to account for every possible scenario that could occur on the road while you're driving. And once they accumulate enough of those, the self-driving car will be more trustworthy than humans. My point here is that your ability to trust someone or something, this is a person, a business, a computer program, whatever it is you're trying to trust, that trust depends heavily on how agile that thing is at responding to the scenarios that they're likely going to need to respond to. To think this through, let's look at Anne Elliot from Persuasion and Mrs. Fanny Dashwood from Sense and Sensibility, and we'll make them zookeepers. Anne Elliot has just started as a zookeeper, and she's never really done this before, and she's fairly young. And Mrs. Fanny Dashwood has been at this particular zoo for many, many different years, and she's seen everything, as they say. So which zookeeper do you trust? Since we're talking about trust and agility, we should paint a picture of how complex the decision-making is at a zoo. What kinds of work-related decisions do these zookeepers make on a day-to-day basis? If an animal dies on a worker's watch, should you fire that person? What if that person has a history of some mistakes, but not an out-of-the-ordinary number of mistakes? What if you can't quite tell the cause of the animal's death? Do you trade 3 zebras for a polar bear if given the opportunity to trade with other zoos? Sometimes animals don't get along with their cage mates. They have personality clashes. If you put 2 monkeys together and they don't get along in the first few days, do you separate them or give them more time to adapt? How do you mediate a conflict between employees? What are the limits of what a penguin trainer can train penguins to do for a show? What should be out of bounds for entertainment? These are complex decisions with dimensions of values and justice at play. They're on the human end of the trust spectrum. So do you trust Anne Elliot or Mrs. Fanny Dashwood more with these types of decisions? And let me tell you a little bit more about the character of these two people. Anne Elliot is a journaler. When she makes a mistake, she journals about what she did and what she'll do differently next time. When she doesn't know how to handle a situation, she asks questions and she watches how things turn out and then she journals on it. She writes down notes about the different animals' personalities and the different people's personalities. Mrs. Fanny Dashwood, on the other hand, is a justifier. When she makes a mistake, she makes up a story to make it sound like she's done nothing wrong. And then she believes her own version of this. So because of this, she makes the same mistakes over and over again. Now who do you trust as a zookeeper? Well, if it's Anne Elliot's 3rd day on the job, maybe you should trust Mrs. Fanny Dashwood a little bit more. It's just like right now, you should probably not trust a self-driving car more than you trust a person to drive you on the snow. But 20 years from now, your answer about trusting the self-driving car in the snow might be different than it is today. Just like 20 months from now, your answer about trusting Anne Elliot as the zookeeper might be different than it is today. You trust Anne because she keeps a phenomenal journal where she learns from her mistakes. So how does this relate to blockchain? Well, we're talking about trust in situations that require agility and responsiveness and attention to the human experience and human values. And we just noted how well Anne Elliot's notebook served her in accumulating experience. Now, we know that blockchain is a public, immutable, global ledger, and I think of blockchain as a stone in the middle of a prehistoric village where people can chisel things permanently into that stone for everyone in their community to see. So, you guessed it, I'm going to suggest that blockchain is a public, collective version of Anne Elliot's notebook. We remember that the blockchain ledger is good for keeping track of facts, property rights, and contracts. When it comes to the first two of these, what matters for trust is the answer to the question, are these facts or property rights valid? And there are some types of validity that can be determined mechanically. For example, you can decide if the statement 3 + 2 = 5 is a valid statement, and you can do that mechanically. Determining validity on the Bitcoin blockchain is purely mechanical. So you trust software more than you trust people to do that, which I explain in another video. But some types of validity are not currently best determined mechanically. And for that reason, it's worth talking about the ways that the ticker on our trust system can be moved, like we've been talking about the whole video. To think about this, we remember that contracts are if-then statements, and there's probably a lot of if-then statements in Anne Elliot's notebook. If the lions get into fights, increase their protein intake. If the monkeys won't eat their dinner, move their dinner time out by half an hour. If the polar bears get too lazy, put more toys in their pool, etc., etc. And the accumulation of these if-then statements makes us trust Anne Elliot more and more over time and essentially contains her wisdom. Well, the smart contracts we put onto a blockchain, those are just if-then statements, right? Now, what does blockchain give us that we can't get from a single person's notebook like Anne Elliot's? It gives us a way of accumulating the wisdom of many different people. And basically, the world is complex enough as it is, such that one person's wisdom that they accumulate across a single career is insufficient for the wisdom we need to make a company trustworthy. But the wisdom of the masses can do that. To accumulate wisdom of the masses, we need a space where people can write up their little contracts that add exceptions to the rule according to their experience, more or less. But that space where people write stuff, that needs to be not easily corrupted. And there's this unfortunate feature that the more powerful a space becomes, the more energy people will put into hijacking that space for their own purposes. If we have space for accumulating wisdom of the masses, it will eventually become powerful, and therefore it'll eventually be a target for attack. One nice thing about blockchains is that they're harder for people to hijack or attack, because there's no central place you can go to concentrate your energies. But that's for another video. The main purpose of this video is to give me an excuse to go to the zoo and take pictures of cute animals, but I also hope the video gave you a framework for thinking about trust and blockchain. These aren't the only factors involved in blockchain and trust. For one, transparency is a huge issue, and blockchain really helps with transparency. But trust is a complex subject, so I'll do more videos on trust and blockchain coming up. So subscribe if you're still curious.